Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jeffrey Nutlin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Writers Workshop. The workshop is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing and amplifying Asian American literary culture. Since our founding in 1991, we have worked to cultivate a radically inclusive community of Asian and Asian diasporic writers and readers to mobilize for a more just future. We are thrilled to partner with our friends at PEN America tonight to celebrate award-winning novelist Julie Otsuka and her incredible new book, The Swimmers. PEN America's mission is to unite writers and readers to celebrate creative expression and freedom to write for all. PEN Out Loud is a year-round conversation series featuring a diversity of voices, including authors, poets, journalists, artists, and activists. On behalf of PEN America and the Asian American Writers Workshop, I also want to extend deep gratitude to our other event partners, the Strand Bookstore and Scripps College, and of course to our friends at ProBono ASL for providing interpretation this evening. The Swimmers is Julie Otsuka's first novel in over a decade. It is a meditation of words, using intimate details to tell a big story that explores kindness, love, and how our histories follow us through time. We'll kick off tonight's event with a brief reading from Julie, after which she will be joined in conversation by the author of the memoir, All You Can Ever Know, and contributing writer and editor at The Atlantic, Nicole Chung. There will be time for Q&A after their conversation, so be sure to submit your questions using either the Ask a Question button below or in the chat. We'll be sure to collect them and go through them at the end of the night. With that, it gives me great pleasure to call to the virtual stage Julie Otsuka. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm very nervous and excited. This novel has been just many, many years in the making, so I can't quite believe that this day is finally here. And I'm so grateful to everyone. So I'm going to start by just reading the first two chapters of the novel. And the chapter title is called The Underground Pool. The pool is located deep underground in a large cavernous chamber many feet beneath the streets of our town. Some of us come here because we are injured and need to heal. We suffer from bad backs, fallen arches, shattered dreams, broken hearts, anxiety, melancholia, anhedonia, the usual above-ground afflictions. Others of us are employed at the college nearby and prefer to take our lunch breaks down below in the waters, far away from the harsh glares of our colleagues and screens. Some of us come here to escape, if only for an hour, our disappointing marriages on land. Many of us live in the neighborhood and simply love to swim. One of us, Alice, a retired lab technician now in the early stages of dementia, comes here because she always has. And even though she may not remember the combination to her locker or where she put her towel, the moment she slips into the water, she knows what to do. Her stroke is long and fluid. Her kick is strong, her mind clear. Up there, she says, I'm just another little old lady. But down here at the pool, I'm myself. Most days, at the pool, we are able to leave our troubles on land behind. Failed painters become elegant breaststrokers. Untenured professors slice shark-like through the water with breathtaking speed. The newly divorced HR manager grabs a faded red styrofoam board and kicks with impunity. The downsized ad man floats otter-like on his back as he stares up at the clouds on the painted pale blue ceiling, thinking, for the first time all day long, of nothing. Let it go. Worriers stop worrying. Bereaved widows cease to grieve. Out-of-work actors, unable to get traction above ground, glide effortlessly down the fast lane in their element. At last, I've arrived. And for a brief interlude, we are at home in the world. Bad moods lift, tics disappear, memories reawaken, migraines dissolve, and slowly, slowly, the chatter in our minds begins to subside. As stroke after stroke, length after length, we swim. And when we are finished with our laps, we hoist ourselves up out of the pool, dripping and refreshed, our equilibrium restored, ready to face another day on land. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading, Julie. And it's great to be here with you. Congratulations on your publication. I have read and loved all your books and given them to friends and family, so that's just a thrill to get to talk to you tonight. I had a really hard time deciding what to ask you first, actually, because there are things I'd love to kind of dive into, and I worry about like going into spoiler territory because the book just came out. But I think this is a safe question to start with, and it's just about the origins of this novel, which, you know, I think are very much at home with your first two books, and also felt like a little bit of a shift. So I was wondering if you could talk just about the first spark or seed of an idea that made you want to write this particular book.
Yeah, I had sketched out a few scenes, actually very rough drafts of the 2 paragraphs that I just read, many, many years ago, before I'd finished my last novel, The Buddha in the Attic. And then I just put them in a drawer and kind of forgot about them. And when I finished The Buddha in the Attic, I pulled those scenes out, and I knew that there was more to this world that I wanted to write about. And I just thought it was such a fascinating, kind of quirky, odd world just unto itself. And it seemed like a microcosm of the larger world. And I also I hadn't ever written anything except for one chapter of the novel, actually, that is, it was published as a short story, Diem Perditi. But other than that story, everything that I've written has been set in the past. So it was really, it's kind of a relief, actually, and a challenge to be writing in the present day. And then I wanted to deal with my own experience as a daughter of a mother who was failing from dementia, and explore my feelings about that. And I guess so the seed of the novel was just really, I had these 2 kind of very disparate halves, and I wasn't sure, you know, how I would put them together until I finally kind of got the idea. And it's an oddly shaped book. Just the form is just, it's just really like there are 2 worlds, and there's a split right down the middle. Right. And I hope it works. I think it might be confusing for some readers, and maybe for others not. But for me, organically, it kind of made a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does work. I know I'm like one data point here, but so just to talk about the structure then. So as in the first 2 paragraphs, you read, like, you know, we begin with the pool, and it is a very world building chapter, you know, a microcosm of the world outside, but also an escape from it, where you don't really escape yourself, but you get the story in kind of a collective narrative, like with a group. And, you know, then the story goes on and we get back on land. And I think that's the shift that you're talking about, and sort of narrow the focus to this one character, Alice, who's in your first page, the older woman experiencing dementia, and, you know, all that happens to her family and her husband and daughter. Can I just ask, like, you know, it was a surprising sort of structure to me. And I guess I'm wondering how did you land on sort of the multi-part connected, but each chapter feels so separate? Like, how did you kind of land on that structure finally? Like, was there any particular thing that unlocked it for you?
No, I think I kind of made up the structure as I went along. I mean, I wrote that middle chapter, Diem Perditi, few years after I sketched out those 2 scenes, but I wrote it in its entirety. So that was just a standalone piece. And I now think of it as kind of being this still center of the novel. But I began the first chapter, The Underground Pool, just because I wanted to explore this world. And so it is, like you said, world building.
Mhm.
And then after that, I got the idea for a crack, which just seemed like something that could be terribly ominous. We're not sure what it is, but really it's about the end of this Edenic underworld. And I think when I finished the crack, I realized that there could be a shift from that to Diem Perditi. And we would suddenly surface in this, I think, kind of with a shock. I think it's kind of a shock to the reader to suddenly find themselves in this above ground world. And suddenly the focus is just really narrowed, onto one character, onto Alice. And I wanted Alice to be there from the very beginning, but almost in a very peripheral way. So I didn't necessarily want the reader to realize from page one that it was going to be her story. So I wanted it to be a little bit of a surprise when we surface and enter her world more completely.
I mean, I think it was definitely. And then, going straight from the chapter about the crack and the beginning of the end of this world for all of these swimmers. And then you see sort of the beginning of like almost like the crack in Alice's life is beginning and like shooting off its own little cracks, I guess. Can you talk about Alice and her daughter in the story? And you've already mentioned writing this was partly a way to sort of like face what was happening or had happened to your own mother. But without prying, I guess, like how were you thinking about them as characters, separate, obviously, from your family? Was there anything that particularly helped you unlock Alice and also her daughter, who's an incredibly vivid character that we also see a bit later in the book?
Yeah, I think it's always voice for me that allows me to write about a certain either story or character. I actually had tried writing about the Alice character in the third person. And then when I finally landed on the second person, that seemed to be the right voice. I was not able to write about the daughter character in the first person. I think I'm just averse to writing in the first person. I don't feel comfortable at all yet, but I think I might be creeping up to it. But as soon as I landed on the use of the second person, that allowed me to kind of ease my way into the writing of those chapters.
And when I think about your books, that's what I think about are those narrative shifts and the switch from third to second, like first person collective, plural. It's kind of a hallmark of Buddha in the Attic too, every chapter and that different perspective. And I always find myself marveling at how well you write in all these different perspectives, like how much you're able to reveal, even though sometimes I feel like certain perspectives can feel distancing when other people write them. And it really doesn't with your work. And I think the shifts provide a lot of propulsion too. Like with the swimmers, I kept wondering, okay, who are we going to get in the next chapter? What voice are we going to get? And it was one of the things that made me eager to keep going. I guess I'm curious how you figured out this is like how you like to write novels. I'm just curious. It's distinctive and I love it.
I think it actually, it keeps the writing more interesting for me when I'm constantly changing points of view. I don't get too comfortable with any one voice. And I think I like a challenge with every book and also with every chapter within the book. From book to book, I like to go someplace completely different. And with the chapters too, I think I wanted to explore just very, very different things with each chapter. So I feel like I almost get a fresh new beginning with each chapter.
That makes sense. I'm just curious if you had like a favorite, do you have a favorite voice to write in, or does it depend on the character?
I'm actually really now enjoying writing in the second person, which I hadn't done until I wrote Diem Perditi, the middle chapter. And then when I wrote the last chapter, that I also used that. So it was only the second time that I'd ever used that second person voice. And I think that I'm working on something new. It's a little too early to talk about it, but I think I'm going to continue to use that you voice. Maybe just because it's new, it's kind of exciting to me. I'm not really that comfortable with it yet. But I remember when I first stumbled upon the first person plural, the we voice with Buddha in the Attic, that was thrilling because it was brand new. I never used that voice before. And it was just really was very freeing in a way. It was very new. And it just allowed me to tell a much larger story than I could have otherwise. So I guess each new narrative voice that I adopt, I try out for a while and then maybe I get tired of it and then move on to something else.
Were you always a writer, like growing up? I guess I'm always curious about a writer's origin story. When and how did you come to it? Why were you drawn to it?
No, I began writing rather late. I was an art major in college, so I studied first figurative sculpture, and I didn't even know that that I could draw until I took a drawing class my first year at Yale, and much to my surprise, I got an A plus. I just had this skill that I didn't know I had. It was very natural. I'd never taken drawing classes as a kid. I mean, I sketched out, I don't know, Charlie Brown when I was a kid. Drawings of horses, like many girls do when they're 10, over and over and over again. But then I took a figurative sculpture class, and I just fell in love with the stuff of clay and just looking at things, objects, eventually the human figure, and trying to figure out what was going on with the curves and lines in space. And then I took a painting class, and then I fell in love with the medium of paint. It was just so gorgeous and lush. Just the stuff of oil paints. It's wonderful stuff. And even the smell of paint and turpentine and just being in the studio. So I spent really the last 2 years in college, basically in the studio, just painting all the time. And I loved it. And I pursued painting quite seriously throughout my 20s. I started a graduate program in Bloomington, Indiana, and then dropped out after 3 months because I couldn't really handle the pressure of graduate school. And I moved to New York City, and I studied at the studio school for a couple of years. And I eventually just became very frustrated. I think I realized that I would never be able to make the paintings that I was seeing in my head. I knew visually what I wanted to make, but I could never quite technically execute.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stopped painting, and then I just for the first time, I read a lot of contemporary fiction for a couple of years, just really as a form of solace, because I was just very depressed about not having succeeded as a painter. And so then I very tentatively began to try my hand at writing, but very much in the spirit of play. I felt like I had nothing to lose. It was just something I liked to do. So I never thought I would end up becoming, a real writer.
It's interesting what you're saying about painting and how it was frustrating to not get something like exactly technically what you'd envisioned. Is that not the experience of writing as well for you? Maybe that resonated very strongly with me in terms of writing.
Actually, it's not. And one reason why is I think when I was painting, I always had these just beautiful first drafts. I could just sketch out something on the canvas, and then I would lose that. I would paint over it, and I would keep working the painting, and I would just lose that first impulse. And with writing, I feel like if I have an impulse for a scene, I can just sketch it out very loosely, but I can always save, you can save as many drafts as you want when you're writing. And then also, I think I just feel more comfortable with language. I think I feel more at home with words. I feel like with a lot of hard work, I can always get to where I want to go. I mean, I'm often frustrated, which I think is just totally normal and part of the process. But ultimately, I feel like I'm able to finish things. I wasn't always able to finish paintings. I was wonderful at starting them, but whereas with writing, I feel like I can have an idea. It might not come out clearly the first time, but if I work at it hard enough, I can usually bring that idea to fruition.
You've been working on this novel for a long time. I mean, you mentioned that you wrote a couple of scenes while you were still working on the Buddha in the attic. Was there anything that really helped you kind of maintain your focus and sustain that energy, like keep your intentions in mind, working on a book over the course of a decade, essentially?
Yeah, I don't think, it's funny. I don't think my attention ever really flagged. I mean, I had a routine. I would go to my neighborhood cafe every day. That really helped. It was like my unofficial office. And then I stopped doing that during the pandemic. So that was a very different writing experience to be writing at home alone in my apartment. But, I also do a lot of research. So, if I ever felt stuck, I would just remind myself to just start doing more research. And I take notes just literally by hand, in a notebook. And there's something about the physical act of just writing things down with a pen that helps me get those facts into my brain in a different way than, if I were typing out those facts, they probably wouldn't stay with me. They wouldn't stick in the same way. So it's a very slow process because the research process is very, very slow.
I would love to, actually, I wanted to ask you about your research process. I can only imagine, like, it was so obvious with your first two books, it must have been exhaustive research. But for this one too, like several parts where I was thinking, especially some of the more medical parts, or I don't know, I'm just curious of what your research was like for this book, what that process was like. Maybe less the like nuts and bolts of it, but more like what exactly did you need to research? Like what gaps did you need to fill in order to write this?
I read a lot about just dementia in general, and a little bit about my mother's own particular dementia, which Alice has, which is Pick's disease. But I also, I don't know if you noticed, but the form of dementia that the people in the care home are suffering from and that Alice is suffering from is initially never mentioned. So I felt like I had a lot of leeway with scientific facts. Like there's some made up facts in the book. So and also in the crack chapter too, that was, I didn't do any research about actual pool cracks until after I'd written most of the chapter. But a lot of, what was happening with that crack was just purely invented. So I did a little bit of research into the business of nursing homes, which was just fascinating, and a little
distressing.
Depressing, yes.
So unlike your first two books, which include the Japanese American incarceration during World War II and also the aftermath, those stories expand beyond that as well. But Alice's experience of camp is really in the background of this story. And what's noticeable is as her memory sort of goes, some of her strongest remaining memories are from camp. Like those are the ones she was holding on to, among others. I guess I was curious how important it was to you to still weave that into this story. It's a very different type of story than the first two novels, but was it really important to have that? How did you make that decision?
Yeah, in a way, I see this novel as being the third piece of a trilogy. Mm-hmm. So I like that there's a character in the novel who could really be like the girl in my first novel, When the Emperor Was Divine. She would be the same age as that girl. She could also be one of the women in the Buddha in the Attic, who's leaving for the camps. So I wanted there to be a through line, but it's not really important that the reader know that. But for myself, I wanted that through line to be there. And I guess what I like also, though, in the beginning of The Swimmers is you don't know Alice's ethnicity. You don't really know anybody's ethnicity. I wanted my pool to be a very democratic space. More swimmers of all kinds were welcome. And I know that swimming pools historically have not been democratic spaces at all. But in my fictional pool, all were welcome. And only very slowly do we realize that Alice is indeed Japanese American, but it doesn't really matter in the beginning. But it was important to me as a writer that she was.
It's interesting you mentioned this book is sort of like the third in a trilogy, and I think it feels very different, but that's so true. And also, if the first two books are about sort of memory and about history and about the importance of those memories, this book is really so much about like losing that connection. I know just from reading other interviews that you've done that you did a ton of research for the first two books, and it was partly because like your family members' experiences of camp were just not really talked about very much. Did you kind of pull from that same well of research for this book, or were there new things you were trying to learn and uncover about your own family history specifically, because this was such a personal story as well?
Yeah, there were stories that I heard from my mother in her waning days with her dementia that I did weave into the book. And these were stories that I hadn't necessarily heard before. So there was a freeing up of her memory that happened as she was beginning to forget, paradoxically. And so there were stories that surfaced that I'd never heard before. And I wanted to capture those. And I wanted, just for myself as a writer, not to forget those stories.
I hope it's okay to share this, but I had like a similar experience with my mother and grandmother. They were actually always kind of storytellers. There wasn't a lot they were hiding, but like toward the end of their lives, that is when I started to hear things that I hadn't before. And also my grandmother's case, she also had dementia, which was another reason I was really very strongly connected to this book. And I remember hearing things from her in her last year, especially, that like had never heard before, like growing up in Jamestown and like moving across the country. Just like, I don't know, in a way it was hard because I knew why those moments were kind of floating up like flotsam, but also like it was very meaningful to hear that from her. Thank you for indulging me that little aside, but I'm curious. So, if there was, like you mentioned a writing routine and how that had to shift during the pandemic. So then what did your writing routine end up being as you worked on this book? Like, I guess over the last couple of years, especially.
Yeah, I actually found that I had a lot more time because I wasn't going to the cafe every day and I wasn't going to the gym, several times a week. So I really had no excuse not to finish the last chapter. And I was able to settle down fairly easily, much to my surprise. And so I wrote the entire last chapter at home in my apartment. And I think the writing went more quickly than the writing of the previous chapters. And maybe it's just because I had fewer distractions and more time on my hands. And yet it was not nearly as pleasant to be working at home as it is to be working in a cafe. I just miss the community of regulars and smell of the coffee, just the clatter of, forks and spoons. And I really like working in public spaces. I somehow am able to get into the zone when I'm in a cafe. Something very, very pleasant about that for me as a working environment.
Have you been able to sort of get back to a little bit of that? Like, has it been like restorative?
Not yet, because I can't really work out of doors. I need to be inside, and I don't yet feel ready to be indoors.
I wanted to talk to you about what I think of as like another hallmark of your writing, which are these flowing sentences and like what Rachel Cohn calls your lists and litanies in her New York Times review of this book. I love them. And, she compares some of the looping sentences and scenes that sort of keep building and building on each other to a swimmer's laps accumulating, which I was really struck by. But what I love about them is that it's always surprising somehow. Like, it's never predictable. When you think you know what you might be building to, there's always a deft turn, or there's some kind of poignant moment or surprise. Again, like my question is, how did you figure out this was almost like stacking and like surprising the reader that way? Like, how did you figure out this is one way that you like to write?
I don't know is the honest answer. I think I'm just naturally a list maker, but it's not, it's not what I aspire to be. But there is something I like. I guess maybe I like collecting things or collecting factoids and then arranging, just arranging them in different ways and seeing which configuration best conveys what it is that I want to say. And I do like the occasional kind of just punchy surprise that comes in from out of nowhere. I like that as a reader too, to encounter that when I'm reading.
I was really struck by in some of those moments, just like the humor and the often dry and tongue-in-cheek, especially if it's like Alice. She's kind of a hoot as a character, and even as her memory goes, and that's one of the more vivid and like wonderful things about her. Again, I don't want to just assume that you got that from your mother, but like I was curious, like how, in terms of Alice's voice and just her inner thoughts and monologue too, or like the snappy things that she'll say to like her daughter or her husband. I mean, that seems like it'd be really fun to write. Was it? Did you really enjoy writing her, even though I'm sure it was a little bit challenging as well?
I did, and I enjoyed using the humor muscle as well. I mean, before I began to write my first novel, I was only writing just comedic fiction. So I never thought of myself as being a serious writer until I wrote the first chapter of my first novel, When the Emperor Was Divine. But I've always, I feel like there's humor in everything that I write, but it's sometimes there very, very quietly. And I feel like in this novel, I was able to foreground the humor more than in past novels. And it's funny. I mean, I remember my own mother as being, actually, she had my father too. I think the whole family, we do have a sort of dry sense of humor that I just kind of take for granted. That's kind of how we communicate, I think. So it's not something that I consciously try to insert, just when I think of just replicating the family, that's just kind of what comes out. And I think it's also just how my brain works.
I'd be curious to know, like, if there were any, obviously this is fiction and it's not your life, even though you were writing it in part, you know, to honor a part of your life.
Mhm.
What are some of like the biggest departures in this book? Or, you know, things that you really wanted to be in the story, even though it was very much not like your family's or your mother's experience?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to say what is based on my real life and what is not. I mean, I'd rather it just be a mystery. But I can say that there are things that are completely inverted, you know. But I don't want to say which things that they are. But I took elements from my own personal life, but then I really reconfigured them for my own aesthetic purposes into a story. So there's just a lot of things. I would never want anyone to read this as autobiography because
Of course.
it
Yeah.
really is not. Yeah.
Did you learn anything about yourself as a writer while writing it?
Oh, that's a good question. I felt a little looser for some reason, even though it took me longer to write this novel. I just felt a little looser with the writing. And I think I just learned that it was okay not to be serious all the time. And I had no idea how a novel, whose first half is set in a swimming pool would be received. It seemed like a kind of crazy conceit to me initially. But I feel a little freer now to explore other kind of crazy seeming ideas. I mean, it's almost a mythical world. It's not science fiction, but it's a very odd world. And I'm kind of interested in going into those spaces in the future.
There's this sort of like element of the fantastic or fanciful in the crack chapter, especially. I guess too, in like the speculations of the swimmers in terms of like what they imagined it could be or what they think it could mean, or like, is it doom? Is it even really there? Again, just like the humor in this book and the sense of playfulness, even though there's clearly something very, very serious lurking at the root. I want to ask, like, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but like, are you a swimmer? Was this partly inspired because you enjoy going to pools?
Yeah, I grew up in Northern and then Southern California. So I grew up spending a lot of time at the beach with my best friend between the ages of 10 and 18. And I love swimming in the ocean. So I'd never really done any lap swimming as a child, but I was very, very comfortable in the water, in a certain kind of water, wild water, salty water, waves. And then, I spent most of my adult life in New York City. So I began going to a recreational pool in my neighborhood. And I swam there every day for many, many years, or 5 days a week. And that was such a different experience of being in the water. there's really no weather. The water is the same every day.
Yeah.
It's very still. Yeah, it's chlorinated. It's not wild. But I was kind of fascinated by the community of regulars who went there, and also the bonds that formed among swimmers over the years, as well as the scene in the locker room.
You do such a wonderful job of characterization with these quick glancing moments, because of course when you're telling this story in the collective, you can't get into paragraphs and paragraphs about each individual person. But I thought I loved the way, and again with the humor, how you managed to kind of do a very quick sketch of someone where even if you don't, get a whole well-rounded profile from your description, you think, as a reader, I know this person, like I can figure out his type. I thought that was wonderful. And yeah, that also made it kind of a delightful surprise in a way when the story does narrow, because it could have narrowed on any one of them in a sense. I just really loved that. I was going to ask too, if there were parts of this that were either especially challenging or especially fun to write.
The Bella Vista chapter, which is set in the care home, was actually a lot of fun to write. I've never taken on the voice of a slightly malign, evil institution before. I've often...
You're great at it.
It was a surprise. I've often written from the point of view of the victim, right? Japanese being sent to the camps during World War II. So this was new, and I found that I really kind of enjoyed it, much to my surprise. And that was it was just a lot of fun to write. The crack chapter was also just a lot of fun to go to town with, because I guess I like speculating, so my brain could just kind of endlessly speculate about what this crack could be and how people would react to it.
Are there particular, I don't know, once you started sharing this with people, were there particular reader reactions that really meant a lot to you? Or have there been responses to your first books that I guess meant a lot to you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate with my first two books, especially with the first novel. And then I got to tour a lot on the West Coast after I'd written When the Emperor Was Divine, which is about a Japanese American family sent to a camp during World War II. And I got to meet a lot of the people I was writing about that I'd spent years thinking about. Older Japanese Americans who'd been sent to the camps during World War II sometimes came to my readings. And that was just on a purely personal level, it was an amazing and humbling experience to meet those people. And most of them, unfortunately, are now gone. Yeah, and so I forget. I can't remember.
I was actually asking too if there were, I don't know if there were particular reactions you've gotten to this book.
Yeah, actually, I did not. I don't show my work to very many people as I'm writing. So usually my agent is my first, and often for many years only reader, and I trust her judgment completely. So I don't like to hear a lot of feedback while I'm working on something. I call it being inside the egg. I just need to be in this safe womb-like space, and then when I'm finally finished with something and ready to put it out there, then I welcome all criticism, and I'm not precious at all about changing things. And I know, if something's not working, I'll work on it. I'll change it. But so I didn't get a lot of feedback for what seemed like a very crazy story as I was working on it. And I have yet to speak to many readers.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you're saying about that process is extremely relatable. And I just want to mention for the folks watching that we'll shift to audience questions soon. So please do get your questions in the chat. I'll probably move over in just a couple minutes. I wanted to ask too, just about, when you mentioned that you used to go to the gym several times a week, you were in this routine, and you mentioned always writing in a cafe, and because of the pandemic, you had to stop doing that. And as you were saying that, it made me think this book, at least in the opening, it is so much about routine. I don't want to call it addiction or obsession, but I guess maybe the swimmers would, in your story, were there, I don't know, was that something you explicitly wanted to delve into in this book? The way we get attached to those those things.
Yeah, that's really insightful, actually, because I was thinking while I was writing about the swimmers, and I would call it addiction to the pool and to the act of swimming. I was thinking, this is kind of how I felt about going to the cafe. I just had this need to go every day, or if I came back from a trip, the first place I'd want to go after I, dumped off my suitcase was to the cafe. It was just this physical need to go to this space and see these people. So that need is something that I definitely did want to explore.
Yeah, for sure. And then like, it's also like what happens when those things are removed, like in a way when Alice can't go to the pool anymore, that is when things sort of start to unravel. Was that also sort of a deliberate shift? I might be reading too much into that.
No, I think that it's really important for people to be in community. I think that's kind of what keeps us alive. It's what keeps our brains, especially as we get older, alert. It's really important not to be isolated. And I think that contributes to her demise, the fact that the pool is closed and she's no longer physically active, socially active, just having daily interactions with these people who've known her and cared about her for many, many years.
So I'm wondering, and you sort of addressed this earlier where you mentioned like there are moments in the swimmers that are drawn like from stories that your mother told you. I don't want to ask like, specific ones, but I guess I'm wondering like if you could just talk a little bit about like how you manage that balance when writing something that's obviously a work of fiction that's not your life or your family, but like there were some important things that you wanted to incorporate, like what was that like for you? It seems as though it would be sort of a different process than your first two books, which were less personal.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had and still have a little bit of trepidation about writing about, in fictional form about my own family in such an immediate way. And yet, I think as an artist, as a writer, I am at a certain point ruthless and just write what I want to write and then try to save the worrying for afterwards. I don't want to let the fear of offending people get in the way of the writing as I'm writing.
Now that this book has, I was going to ask, because there are usually a lot of writers in the crowd at PEN events and AAW events. I just wanted to ask if you had any advice for aspiring novelists, people working on projects, maybe long projects.
Yes, I would say to try to build up a daily practice. I think a lot of writing, I mean, you have to have some talent to begin with, but I feel like the writers that I've known who've made it are the ones who've really just stuck it out. And just, I mean, I think a lot of writing is just hard work and putting in the time and hours and just not giving up. Also, I think it's really important to read.
Who are some important authors for you? Not necessarily who've influenced your work directly, but when you mentioned how you spent like a solid couple of years reading after no longer being in grad school and no longer painting, like who were those writers that sort of brought you back and brought you into this life?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about those writers and I haven't read them for a long time, but I remember I would go to the Strand bookstore quite regularly when I stopped painting. And I didn't know anything about the lay of the land in terms of contemporary fiction. And I remember pulling a book by Lydia Davis off the shelf. It was a collection of her short stories called Break It Down. And they were very, very short. And I just love them. I had no idea who she was. And they're just like these mini psychological kind of musings. And she has this kind of linear Cartesian logic that was just really appealing to my brain. I just loved reading her. And then I began to read, I read a lot of Richard Ford short stories, Raymond Carver, Anne Beatty, just the kind of realist, kind of minimalist, Amy Hempel. She was funny too. I loved her short stories, but it was like going into a candy store. I mean, it was just this whole new world for me. And I found I really just loved reading stories in particular.
I'm going to go ahead and shift to audience questions. I might sprinkle a few of my own if we have time to, but I just want to thank you so much, Julie, for this book and your conversation and your generosity in sharing with us tonight.
Oh, Nicole, thank you.
My pleasure. It was an honor. Okay, the first question from the audience. Do you still paint? And are the two processes, writing and painting, symbiotic in any way?
No, I no longer paint. It's too fraught for me. I think I can't even casually sketch. Maybe someday I'll be able to do that, but not now. And I find the process is actually very similar. I mean, one, there's the discipline of just going to the studio every day, or going to my desk every day, or going to the cafe every day. And also, when you sketch out a scene on the canvas, I would just sketch out a scene very loosely and just bring up the details gradually. I would never focus on any one particular detail. And that's what I tried to do when I was sketching out a scene on the page, a paragraph. I just sketch it out loosely and not get stuck on polishing one particular sentence, but just try to bring everything into focus in an all over way.
I'm curious, do you still like to sculpt with clay, or?
No, that I've not done for a long time. But I can, if I close my eyes and think, I can still smell just the smell of damp clay in the studio. But no, I haven't done these things for a long time. But for many years after I began to write, I would still have anxiety dreams, not about a blank page, but it was always about a blank canvas.
This is kind of a playful question, but I love it, actually. There are many memos on your wall. I did not notice this until I saw the question. Are they part of the story process or reminders for grocery shopping?
Actually, and there are many more memos on the wall right to my left that you can't even see. One of them actually is a grocery shopping list that says soy milk and coffee, but the rest
essentials.
The rest are all actually notes for this thing. I don't even know what it is that I'm working on now, but I am very visual, so and I have more memos on a wall over there. I would have memos just all over my room if I had enough wall space, but I love writing things down, ideas for scenes, and then, I use a lot of yellow Post-its and then putting them here, and then you can actually just literally rearrange the scenes. And then often, I forget about, I wrote something maybe months ago, and then I'll walk past it and I haven't looked at that Post-it for a long time, and I'll just think, oh yeah, and it'll just kind of jog my memory. So for me, it's a very kind of physical process.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I totally did not even notice the paper and would not have, so thank you to whoever asked that question. I heard your interview with Terry Gross in NPR, and you talked about your mother's perspective on her life. The cultural concept of gaman came across so strongly. I wonder how this impacted your creation of Alice and her views. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Alice she's very strong. But I think that I see her as actually being more American than Japanese. But she does have that Japanese sense of just toughing it out, for sure. Yeah, but she's also, I think, a little bit looser in her ways. And that, I think, comes from her being American born.
You said you take notes in longhand. Do you write chapters in longhand also, or mostly on a computer?
I usually write in longhand first. I'll write a scene in longhand, and then in the cafe is what I used to do, and then I would go home and I'd type it up, and then I would print out what I just typed up and bring that with me the next day to the cafe and make my edits by hand on the typed up manuscript that I just printed out.
I was talking to a writer recently who also drafts in longhand, which I've never really done myself, but I'm thinking I should try it now. And they mentioned that it was like that extra 10 to 15 seconds that it takes to write a sentence versus type it that helps them connect to it. Is that also your experience of writing in longhand? And if not, why do you write in longhand?
It's about the speed that I think. I'm a very slow writer, so if I were just composing completely on my laptop, my hands would just be hovering above the keyboard for a good amount of time. I wouldn't.
Bad feeling. I can't recommend.
I'm not somebody. I'll see people, in my neighborhood cafe, just typing like crazy for hours, and I could never do that. It could take me, an hour at the least to sketch out a scene in longhand.
More questions about your visual art process. Like, what were your subjects when you were making visual art? Are you trying to capture those same scenes or answer the same questions in your writing?
No, completely different questions. I mean, I was very much concerned with the integrity of the rectangle or the square and just kind of bringing everything up to the surface. It almost didn't matter what I was looking at. I was always working from life, a still life, a view out my window, but it didn't matter what it was that I was looking at. What mattered, I think, was the act of seeing and then translating things from 3 dimension to 2 dimensions through color and mark.
Mhm.
It was a very abstract process, and it was really wasn't necessarily about expressing myself. It was really about apprehending something external to myself, making sense of it in my brain, and somehow translating it into something flat on the canvas that worked in a completely different way. And for me, I mean, painting will always just be magic.
So then, can I ask, like, when you're writing, it's something completely different. Are there what is your aim with your writing then, if it's not the same?
What is my aim?
Well, your aim, or I guess this person was asking, are there questions you're trying to answer? You could narrow it too to, like, maybe were there particular animating questions or like motivations with this particular book?
Yeah, I think I often don't know what I'm writing about as I'm writing. I mean, and each novel has its own kind of organic form. My first novel came to me very visually, just as a series of pictures that I saw in my head that I just literally felt like I was transcribing onto the page. I felt like my brain was almost a camera. And my second novel, The Buddha in the Attic, came to me very differently, very much in terms of sound. It came to me rhythmically. I could just hear the rhythm of the sentences that I wanted to write. So I was just really obsessed with, just where accents fell on words. It was like, I felt like I was writing a song or a chant. And then The Swimmers came to me really as an idea. It came to me more as a concept book. And it was just this world that I wanted to explore, and how could I best go about doing that?
Thank you. I'm going to ask this last question. I'm a fifth-generation Japanese American. I wondered if you have any thoughts on the difference between how it felt writing historical fiction about Japanese Americans versus contemporary, or where might the future of fiction with Japanese Americans go? It's a big question.
Oh, it is a big. I have no idea, actually. I mean, I don't even know where the future of this particular Japanese American. I have no idea where my future will go as a writer. It was very different. It's when you're writing historical fiction, there's a tremendous responsibility, at least that I felt, to do right by my people. And you also have to make sure that you do your homework and get your historical facts right. But I had a lot of doubts. I didn't know if I had the right to tell this particular story about, family being sent to a camp, since it wasn't my own personal story. So I think I had a different set of questions going into those novels than I do now. I began this current novel not necessarily thinking about race. I was just thinking about, people in a pool swimming. Are they fast, medium, or slow swimmers? But I ended up thinking a lot more about race, and in particular Japanese American, what it means to be Japanese American, than I thought I would when I began the book. So somehow I think my mind always does end on that question of, what does it mean to be a Japanese American in the world?
I know I said we'd end there, but I'm going to be obnoxious and throw one more of my own in, just because you mentioned historical fiction and this question dealt with that. And I remember when I talk with writers who've written historical fiction, I always kind of like to ask them this question, which is, I mean, in a way, every novel is historical. Every work of fiction is set within a certain time period, and it's also a product of the time it's written in. And I sort of like to ask, like, writers in general, do you feel as though it's still a useful categorization, like historical fiction, or how do you think about it? Especially, like, maybe if your thoughts about it have shifted over time as you've written it and then moved away from it a little bit with this book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, what any of us is writing now is going to be historical fiction in 10 years from now. So, I mean, I think there's the desire, when one is writing historical fiction, to make it feel contemporary and very much as if it's happening in the present. I mean, you want it to be alive for the reader. At least I do. So I want my historical fiction to seem very, very vivid. So in that way, it's not any different, than my approach to writing fiction set in the now, in the contemporary times.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again for this conversation and for all of your work, which has meant a lot to me and to so many readers. Thank you to everyone who came this evening, and to our sponsors, PEN America and the Strand and Scripps and AAWW. And thank you so much to our ASL interpreters. And Julie, I don't know if you have anything you want to say, but.
Thank you, Nicole. You've been wonderful. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. And I did love your memoir. It's so much. If people haven't read it, they should. It's an amazing story. And it's just very, very touching. I guess thank you to everyone for being so patient and for waiting for me for all these years. I'm just very, very grateful.
Julie, we'll wait another 10 or 20 if we need to. So don't you worry, we're going to be there. Thank you all so much, everyone. This was really wonderful. Take care and be safe.